Hello dear chess friends from the International Chess School. In today's lecture we will continue to study the element of the attack called weak square. Of course, the other important elements of the attack are the speed, creating a local pieces, superiority, the pawn structure, and of course related to the pawn structure we have the weak squares. The game studied will be Ivanchuk Vasily versus Radjabov Teimour in the 5th round of the World Chess Cup in September 2011. It started with e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. This is the signal for the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, and because the Grandmaster Radjabov is known as a specialist of long and forced lines, probably the Grandmaster Ivanchuk chose a quiet line, g3, which has the merit to be a solid line where white can develop a slow offensive, but on the other hand the bishop from g2 will stay rather passive behind the pawn, and it may look strange that white is placing the bishop on the long diagonal h1 a8 when the black king will be on g8, but the classical line with bishop c4 against the dragon leads to very sharp game. Here we will follow strategical game. Knight c6. Of course, black is immediately challenging white's central knight. Knight d2. The knight came on e2, where it will be very flexible. Actually, white in this line often plays something like h3 and g4, and the knight has two good possibilities from e2, g3, and f4 in that case. At the same time, it consolidates the knight from c3, and white preserves a small space advantage due to his central pawn, and because white has the space advantage, it has to avoid minor pieces exchanges. Black played bishop g7, bishop g2, bishop d7. Of course, a good idea for black will be to exchange the light squares bishop from g2 and then to use the weak light squares. In white's camp, especially the f3 square tends to be weak in the absence of the light squares bishop. Immediately white played h3, showing that it has no intention to exchange the light squares bishops. And against the typical setup with g3, g4, black played h5 immediately. I must say that I don't like this pawn structure, and this will be seen later into the battle. Black's main problem is that it no longer has f7, f5 as a possible breakthrough, since the g5 square will be weak, and the g6 pawn will be vulnerable in the absence of the h7 pawn. Of course, its merits are that white no longer can push g3, g4, and his pieces are cramped for the moment on the king side. a4, queen c8, bishop e3. White doesn't rush with the castle. Of course, it can't castle for the time being, but it continues to slowly develops his pieces. With the move a2 a4, white showed his intention to take the space advantage and at the same time to eliminate another possible pawn advance from black side, which is b7 b5. In some cases b5 may work in conjunction with the pressure on h8 b2 diagonal. Black played bishop e6, trying to use the d7 square as a rampant for the knight. This is also a known maneuver, knight e7, knight c5, but this works great in conjunction with the f7 f5, which in our case is no longer possible. And black's choice to push so quickly h7 h5 may prove wrong in the end. Knight d5. If white plays immediately knight f4 here, black has a typical dragon variation maneuver. He will install the bishop on a6 f1 diagonal in the absence of white's light square bishop, and the white king will have difficulties to castle, either short or on the long side. For this reason, white played knight d5. In fact, bishop c4 is no longer possible, and white prepares knight e2 f4, from where the knight attacks the bishop from e6 and defends the h3 pawn at the same time. Black castled. Until now we have a strategical battle, but as you can see, starting with the move bishop e3, knight d5, white is starting to gathering the troops around the black king, and this is possible because of the space advantage. At the same time, look how these pawns are restricting black's pieces activity, and a typical maneuver like knight a5, knight e5, trying to install the knight on c4 will be easily met by b2, b3. In fact, white played rook c1. He wants to get rid of the pin on the long dark squares diagonal. Rook e8, of course, is a logical move to create X-ray pressure along the e file. White is slowly building his position. Played b3, rook b8. Now b7 b5 will be an attempt to create counterplay on the queen side. If you take a look at the black's pieces, you'll see that the bishops are on adjacent diagonals, and his long range pieces, queen c8 and rook b8, are also directed on the queen side. All white has to do is to push c4, and another important element of the pawn structure in attack is that the attacking side is creating a barrier of pawns on the side where the opponent can create counterplay. In this case, white created this wonderful barrier of pawns on light squares, which actually reduces black's counterplay to 0. Black played b6. Of course, a7, a6 doesn't work yet, so if black tries to create some counterplay based on b5, he must take the long way, b7, b6, knight d7 maybe, and then a7, a6, and just in the end b6, b5. Anyway, this kind of counterplay is very predictable and too slow to create problems for white. So black played b6. Another idea behind b6 is to activate the rook along the 7th rank. White simply played knight ef4. He's threatening to take the pair of bishops at some moment to lure black's queen on e6, and then to continue at some point after the short castle with f4, f5, stressing the vulnerability of the g6 pawn. And everything is a consequence of black's move h7, h5. Bishop d7. Of course, black tries to preserve the pair of bishops. Short castle, knight h7. The knight tries to conquer g5, from where it takes 3 important squares under control: e4, f3 and h3. White showed that he's ready to defend the h3 pawn. Of course, another threat behind knight f6 was e5 to chase away the knight from f4, which defends the h3 pawn. And black desperately tries to create an outpost for the knight on g5, and for this reason he employed a pawn sacrifice. Of course, g takes h4 will be terribly bad, since it creates a nice square for the black knight on h5. After knight f6, knight h5. You may ask why the square h5 is weak, since the knight is on f4, but if white wants to continue his attack, he needs to push f4, and for this reason white's move g3, g4 is perfectly justified. It supports f4 followed by f5. During this time, black completely lack counterplay, and the barrier of pawns played an important role here. Black tried queen d8, knight e2, simply threatening to advance f4, and then after f4 there are plenty of ideas. Probably white to-do list will enclose knight 2c3, doubling the rooks with rook c2, rook f2, and at the proper moment f4, f5. Anyway, before pushing f5, white can mix an idea of attack along the d file with rook d2 and e5 in the plan, or simply playing e5 and then f5 in order to make black restrict his pieces with the pawn on e5. Anyway, black desired to keep the g5 square for the knight, and for this reason played e5. He's ready to exchange the e5 pawn for the f2 pawn, and then to install the knight on g5. White played queen d2. It doesn't have to rush, pushing f2, f4. Now the square d4 is well controlled. It is controlled 3 times, and white prepares f2, f4. Bishop e6, f4, e takes f4, knight e takes f4, rook d7. There are natural moves now: rook f2, rook d7, rook cf1. Look how white gathered all his pieces at the proximity of the black king. Actually, the knight from d5 is using an excellent outpost, a weak square, and there are some other squares in black's camp, and a hidden weak square. A weak square is a square which can no longer be defended by a pawn, is f6. And this conclusion can be reached by looking at white's attacking forces: the knight from d5, the doubled rooks, the fact that the queen from d2 and the bishop from e3 are on dark squares. The only white piece which is passive is the bishop from g2, but it has an excellent defensive role. It consolidates the one of the key pawns, the e4 pawn, which assures the space advantage and also participates in the barrier of pawns. Knight e5. Now black threatens to take on g4, bishop takes g4, and after h takes g4 to give a check rook, with knight g4 simplifying the position. King h1, white doesn't agree with that. Knight c6, knight e2. Let's now see all the circumstances, the favorable circumstances for an attack. All white's pieces are at the maximum attacking potential. Maybe only the bishop from g2 doesn't participate, but white can hardly find a way to increase the value of his pieces, and in such cases you have to think of a tactics. It doesn't work other way. And black played g5. Maybe he was afraid of later g4, g5 followed by knight f6, or he simply wanted to after g5 to play something like knight f8, knight g6, and in conjunction with bishop e5 to reach the f4 square. But this allowed whites a wonderful move. In fact, this is the reason I choose this game, because in this case we use the weak square as a hook where we can launch a piece in order to break the coordination in defense. And the Grandmaster Ivanchuk played knight f6. The point is that after knight takes f6, bishop g5 can follow. It's just a pseudo sacrifice, and white will regain the knight from f6 or the queen, which will be pinned along h4 d8 diagonal. And in case of bishop f6, white has a wonderful way to exploit his kingside pieces superiority. After rook takes f6, knight takes f6, you can see that white is attacking with 4 pieces, while most of black's army is out of play. White can play bishop g5 with the simple threat of taking on f6, then installing the queen on h6 and threatening queen h8 mate. And after king g7, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, rook takes, king takes f6. We have a position with the material equivalence, but on the other hand, white is continuing his attack on dark squares, where black misses any defender. Queen h6, king e7, queen takes h4. Then the knight will, the other knight will find a way to d5 by playing knight f4, knight d5, or knight c3, knight d5, and then the h pawn has big chances to be promoted. So this is how the grandmasters use a weak square in modern chess. They gather the pieces there, they create a local piece of superiority, and then try to break the coordination. It is interesting that as long as black defends the f6 square, it is actually one of the best defended squares on the board. The bigger will be the effect, and the black pieces will completely lose coordination, because it has a devastating effect on the most defended square. Why? Black played knight takes f6, bishop takes, knight takes g4, a desperado attempt to create counterplay in a position with the material equivalence. But after bishop takes d8, knight takes, check, rook takes, rook 7 d8. Black has rook and bishop for the queen, but his main problem is the exposed king. On the other hand, the knight from e2 can easily find a good square on h5, another weak square, or of course d5. Queen g5, the threat is simple, knight f4, knight h5. Bishop c8, black is ready to answer with rook e5 after knight f4. Knight f4 anyway, rook e5, queen takes h4. Black is doubling the rooks. Knight h5, of course knight d5 was also strong, with the idea of playing knight c7 and then to penetrate with the queen on d8. Rook 8 e6, queen f4, f6, and bishop f3. Eventually the light square's bishop came into the battle, and it will have a decisive effect. Rook g5, bishop g4. Now black realized that he can't leave the 6th rank with the rook, since the pawn from f6 will be hanging after rook e8, for example. So rook takes h5, bishop takes h5, knight e5, threatening a double attack. Rook g2, creating another simple threat, queen h6 with a pin along the g file. King f8, bishop g4, and black resigned. Of course, after knight takes g4, queen takes g4, the rook from e6 can't defend the bishop from g7, since the bishop from c8 is hanging. The queen from g4 will simply take the bishop from c8. Other moves are also useless, since the king from f8 also prevents bishop f8, and after rook e8, for example, bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, and queen d2 can follow. And after rook d8, queen d5, and black is paralyzed in defense. White is threatening queen b7. Of course, the material advantage is huge, queen and the pawn for 2 minor pieces. I hope you understand this concept of using a weak square as a hook, where you can install a piece in order to disorganize, or a pawn maybe, to disorganize completely the opponent's defense. Till our next meeting, best.